Thank you, John, for joining us at the We Need to Act podcast. It is a great honor to have you with us.
No, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And I would like to start by asking you a question about your journey. How did your journey into exposing greenwashing and environmental misinformation begin?
I guess my whole sustainability journey is a bit of a strange one, so sort of all over the place. I actually started in public policy with the United Nations, so that was kind of my first adult job, and then went into consulting, and then I went on a trip to China. It would have been 2008-ish, and kind of fell in love with the place. And so I decided to move from New York, where I was living at the time, and go to China. But I had to think, okay, how am I going to take all of this really public sector experience that I had up to that point and put it into a very commercial city like Shanghai? So I sort of fell into sustainability that way. And my focus of sustainability is working with private sector companies. So it's kind of the blending of the public and the private sector experience that I had. Greenwashing, though, was something that came along a little bit later. I always knew there was stuff going on, particularly kind of being behind the scenes with a lot of companies and knowing what they do, but nobody was really talking about it. And I still, until recently, nobody really has talked about it too much. So I thought, well, I had written a book, not about greenwashing, about something totally different in sustainability. And I thought, okay, well, I guess there's another one in me somewhere. So I started to tease out a little bit around greenwashing in the corporate sector. And then as I was doing research for the book, The Great Greenwashing, I realized, oh, it's not just corporations doing it, it's governments, NGOs, individuals, celebrities, the ultra wealthy. So it just sort of unraveled from there. And it's sort of been a very wild ride since then, because every time you start to read into something, you have this lens on of, are they lying to me or are they telling me the truth? And so that now colors everything that I read or look at or listen to. I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse.
Well, sometimes I also think about that because my PhD was on sustainability communication and focus on greenwashing. I also think about that. Sometimes I think it is a curse because it is overwhelming because we have to pay attention to everything and
Exactly
decide.
right. And it's everywhere you look. And
Yeah.
I try not to be too cynical, because I am very much of the view that I want to give companies the benefit of the doubt, because a lot of them are doing really amazing things. I've seen it firsthand, but just don't lie. Please.
Yeah. Please don't do that because we really need good information to make better decisions. And in your book, you argue that brands and governments and influencer NGOs, as we mentioned before, are misleading us. So are we naive, or are their tactics simply that sophisticated? What strategies do
Whew.
they use to manipulate?
It's a great question. I think it's a combination of both. I think there's, to a lesser extent than before, consumers used to be naive of this stuff, especially if we go back 10, 20, 30 years. Consumers really didn't know any better. They just assumed that companies weren't going to lie. And I think a lot of people assume there are regulations around this, right? Because there's regulations around marketing and communications. But when it comes to greenwashing, that's a relatively new thing where there's regulation. There's not even that much yet. So I think there was a bit of naivete, but consumers are increasingly becoming much smarter and more sophisticated with the things they read and see, and the trust of corporations is pretty low. So I think that lends well to having a keen eye to observing and knowing when you're being greenwashed. But on the other end of the spectrum, companies that are particularly bad, so they're really the most unsustainable of them, they invest millions of dollars into behavioral research, neurological research, into how to lie to consumers. So instead of investing that money to do something better, they're investing in better ways of lying to people. And that's difficult because as individuals, as human beings, we can't really compete against that. It's very difficult because it is so sophisticated. So we're kind of stuck in the middle. And that's why it's really important that people in general sort of know what they're looking at, know the telltale signs of greenwashing, so that hopefully a lot of that really sophisticated misinformation doesn't end up deceiving people.
That made me think about something that, on one hand, we have that big machine producing misleading information on purpose, those big corporations that really want to do that. But then on the other hand, we have smaller companies that are not familiar with scientific and technical knowledge and information. So they kind of greenwash, but not on purpose
And
because they don't.
that's a really important distinction that I think is missed sometimes in the nuance of this is that not all greenwashing is the same. Like you said, sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's on purpose. If it's accidental, that's okay. We can fix accidents. We can help companies do better. And I think certainly the reason why we're seeing more greenwashing today than ever before is because companies are now joining in to try to be better and be more sustainable, and they're making mistakes because they haven't been led or they don't have the right information. We can fix that. It's the really bad ones that are doing it on purpose, where it's built into their marketing mix and the way they operate. Those are the ones we really, really need to be concerned about. And it's important that we distinguish between the two types so that we give a little bit of grace to companies that are making simple mistakes.
That's true. And I think when they do, they need to be vulnerable, as I say. We need more corporate vulnerability, like assuming that we are doing mistakes. And that's okay because no one has the right solution or recipe to achieve sustainability. But about those big corporations, and especially fossil fuel industry, as we know, and as we have seen now recently in COP, that we ended without a fossil fuel agreement
Yes.
again. And the fossil fuel industry has known since the 60s about the climate impacts and yet invested heavily in denial and misinformation. How can society and especially consumers effectively push back against such powerful actors?
Yeah, it really was the fossil fuel industry and kind of the companies we know about, ExxonMobil and some of the other,
Oh,
Westinghouse, which isn't really around anymore. They really started to do the greenwashing back in the 60s. And they since then they've been able to become very sophisticated to the point of obviously influencing policy. They have their lobbyists in different, halls of power around the world. Like you mentioned, they're basically at every COP now. Oil lobbyists outnumber all but the biggest delegation. So it's a very good question of what do we do about that? And I think for individual consumers, it's important that, like I mentioned before, we become educated and we know when it's being done to us. And especially with the most unsustainable companies. And there's just a few, right? So the sectors. So you're looking at oil and gas, mining, defense, and tobacco. Those are sort of the most unsustainable of sectors. And no matter what they say, they can never be sustainable. It's impossible because their business model is predicated on either killing people, not great, or destroying the planet. So nothing they do can ever be sustainable. So ignore everything they say if it comes down to them talking about their environmental credentials. That's sort of step one. With the other companies that are kind of in the middle, the ones that are trying but maybe making mistakes, or the ones that are, I think about fast fashion a lot, where it's sort of this sector that is teetering on maybe it will become better or maybe it will go the way of a fossil fuel sector, to sort of help them, push them the right direction by, and this sounds so, as I say it, I know it sounds silly to a lot of people given the magnitude of our problems, but as consumers, really speaking with our wallets and making sure that every decision we make, whatever we're spending our money on, we're doing it consciously and we know why we're spending our money and who we're spending it with. I know as I say that, people are thinking, oh my God, that means I have to research. It means I have to pay more. Yeah, probably. And that's the unfortunate reality of where we sort of are with our sustainable development. But that little bit of research and the little bit of, conscious consumption will go a long way in influencing companies to make the right decisions for themselves and for the planet.
that's interesting and ultimately will pay off, hopefully. But there is another thing which is related to those big corporations. You mentioned fossil fuels, oil and gas, fashion. They now run the world and they have a huge influence on our governments. How can we do something about it? Demanding more from governments, because what we are seeing even in the European Union, the setbacks regarding green regulation.
It's a tough spot, right? And I know it's very easy for people to say, oh, just vote for the right politicians. And yes, that's an element of it, sure, but that's not easy. It's not easy at all. So I think the way I conceptualize things is if we're looking at who's in charge or who's doing the work to build a better future, there's sort of three big groups. There's individuals, all of us, and we've sort of been on the front lines of that since the start of the modern movement in the 1960s. It's always sort of been on people to make the difference. And that's fine. Yes, we should still absolutely do the things we're doing. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you have governments, right? And we know that government should be doing most of the work, but we also know they haven't been doing much at all. Like we look at the COP system, we look at performance against the Paris Agreement, and no country has ever been in line with their national targets. It hasn't happened yet in a decade after the Paris Agreement. Then there's also the private sector. So companies, all the companies we consume from. And I think, honestly, given the scale of everything that we're facing, it's really hard for individuals to do a lot. Again, keep doing what we're doing, but the problems are very big. Government's not doing what they should. So it sort of falls on the private sector to do the most. And there's a few reasons. I believe that one is they got us in the mess, so it should be on them to fix it. Number two, they have access to resources, capital, personnel, and a need to be sustainable for their own business models that certainly individuals don't have that access to those things, and governments are just not willing to use it. So the private sector really sort of sits in that middle space of if we as consumers can influence them to make better decisions, then they can actually move the needle in a much faster, better, bigger direction than individuals or governments are able to do.
That's true, if they are willing to do that.
If they're willing to do it is the big if, yes.
Yeah, because as we know, pretty much all the organizations, private organizations, their end goal is profit.
And I don't think there's, at least in my world, my little part of the sustainability universe, talking about building a sustainable future and profit together, I don't think is a major issue as long as building profit is done sustainably. And I know there are going to be ethicists out there that say there's issues with that, and it's not a perfect scenario. I wish there was a perfect scenario, but there's not. So as long as we can encourage them to make that profit in increasingly ethical, more sustainable, better for the planet, better for people ways, I think we will have done our job. And all of that with the caveat that we know there's no such thing as a perfect company, right? Those don't exist, no matter what they say. But how can we help encourage them to be better and hopefully answer that question of how do we make them willing to be better? And I think a lot of that is done with how we spend our money and where we spend it.
That's so true. And as Tyson Yunkaporta said in the past episode, there's nothing wrong with wealth as long as it is not used to coerce people and as long as
Exactly.
it's equally distributed. And you have said that billionaires emit far more than ordinary citizens. And the real debate isn't left versus right, but up versus down, as we have been talking.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, we are constantly told to focus on individual actions like recycling, buying electric cars, saving water, while major emitters go largely unchecked. How has this framing shift attention away from the real sources of emissions? And we have seen that with fossil fuel industry as well, doing that heavily, putting the responsibility on citizens. What does it reveal about power and accountability in the climate crisis?
That's sort of the big issue, right? Is who does what, why, and also who pays for it. Like one of the sticking points with COP has been for many, many years, who's paying for this transition? But if we look at it through the lens of greenwashing, the ultra wealthy in particular have been amazing at greenwashing their image and passing that responsibility back to the consumer. And like we talked about a few minutes ago, the consumer can and should continue to do the things that they're doing. I don't want anybody listening or watching this to stop recycling. Keep recycling. Keep doing better. Keep doing the things that you're doing because those behavior changes have taken us a very long time to get here. So please don't stop doing that because it is making a difference. But it's important to know that just because you've separated your aluminium from your plastic doesn't mean that you're done. That's not going to save the world. It's important, it's an important factor, but it's not everything. There's so much more that you can and should be doing. And I think for some people, they might hear that and think, oh, well, gosh, I guess nothing matters and I don't need to do anything. But I think the other way, I think it's quite liberating because if now you're not just stuck recycling and ticking that box, you're freed up to do a lot of different things. There's so many ways that individuals can contribute to making a better planet or better society, right? It's not just about recycling. There's so many opportunities. You can volunteer, you can read to the elderly, you can go build homes, you can, if environmentalism is your thing, maybe animal welfare is your thing, you want to become a vegan, do that. There are many opportunities. You don't have to do everything. And I think that's really important and a good way to frame our individual actions. But while all of that is happening, we also need to keep putting pressure on the ultra wealthy in particular who are having, like you mentioned, like I said, it's really an up down sort of issue. And by that I mean, we need to be looking up at the people at the top of the wealth pyramid, not left and right to our compatriots who are we're all sort of in the same boat, right? It's really on them to be changing. So if we look at, for example, Oxfam is an amazing resource if anybody wants to research further on the impact of the ultra wealthy in the world. They just released a report, it would have been last month, called Climate Plunder, that really digs deep into this. For example, an ultra wealthy person's, I believe it's their private yachts and their jets in the matter of 2 weeks will emit more than a human does in an entire lifetime. So it's like, what? How do you wrap your mind around this? Like 50 billionaires emit more carbon in 90 minutes than the average human does in a lifetime. Like this is they're just it's crazy numbers, right? It's huge. So we need to put pressure on them. We need to put pressure on the systems of government and regulation around them. So looking at things like, and this goes back to the politics discussion, the government discussion, encouraging things like taxing luxury items. I'm not talking about a Louis Vuitton bag. I'm talking about taxing yachts that they really don't need, or taxing their third private jet that they don't need. It's about awareness, even though again that sounds so small in the grand scheme of things. I think it's so important. And if I think about I spend a lot of time on TikTok, and TikTok's amazing because people there are community building and talking about these things in monumental ways at scale. And that's the kind of stuff we need, because that then eventually over time ends up reaching into the halls of power where regulation starts to change. And again, I know it's kind of demoralizing sometimes talking about this and realizing how slow the process is, but I would rather have a slow process that ends up getting somewhere than all of us just give up and say, forget it, it wasn't worth it at all. Don't do that. Keep working.
That's so true. And where are we at? Well, you mentioned taxation, carbon taxation, for instance.
I think that's an important one. I think as well, with carbon taxation, it doesn't exist yet,
Yeah,
um,
should.
unfortunately, but it has become quite a conversation more recently in a very concerted way. So before we used to talk about things, and it's not even that far long ago, maybe even a couple years ago, we were talking about things like carbon credits, saying that carbon credits are a good thing. And now finally the conversation has become, well, no, that's actually lying about your emissions. So finally we're talking about that. And that's only because we kept putting pressure on politicians to say, hey, that doesn't make sense. Stop with this, essentially greenwashing of the carbon market scheme. So now we're there. So I would venture to guess that these things are going to happen not linearly, but exponentially, right? So we're seeing change now, and that change is going to just go quicker and quicker to become implemented. It's not going to happen tomorrow, not going to happen next year, but it is starting to happen, and it will happen in big ways in our lifetimes and hopefully the not too distant future.
Hopefully. And where do we currently stand on greenwashing regulation, and what kinds of deceptive practices are still slipping through the cracks?
Well, for the second part, they're all still slipping through, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But there are a few markets around the world that are really putting a lot of emphasis on trying to shore up the regulations around unethical marketing and communications, particularly around sustainability. And they're really focused on the environmental side of things right now. So when we talk about sustainability, obviously environment's important, but there's society as well. But it's really focused on environment, which is great. So the EU was leading the way in a lot of ways until
It was.
recently with greenwashing regulation, and they are still doing an amazing job, especially around sort of the fines for companies
Mhm,
making these massive green claims. Shein in
mhm.
Italy was fined $1 million. France hates Shein.
Yeah.
They've given them so many fines, and the UK has done a lot with the shipping industry, the cruising industry, with television adverts as well in the past few months. So that is still happening. So even though the green claims code in the EU hasn't really landed like we thought it might. There is still stuff happening at an individual national level, which is great. Australia, where I am now, is now leading the world when it comes to greenwashing, regulation, and fines. There was just another fine this week or a few days ago for a company. It's sort of happening where the regulators here, not government, but they're sort of quasi government organizations. They're consumer watchdog organizations. They're putting out really hefty fines for companies, particularly in the fossil fuel and financial sectors that are lying. So we're talking tens of millions of dollars that these companies are being fined. There was a company called Energy Australia, one of the big energy retailers here, who was making claims around one of their green products, and they were brought to court and were made to apologize to almost 500,000 customers. So admit that they lied. So these things are starting to happen. And we want obviously to see it happen more. A $12 million fine for a company that makes hundreds of billions of dollars a year doesn't really affect them. But it's more the idea of this momentum. And now people are seeing it come on the news, and people are going, oh, well, what is that? Why were they fined for this? What is greenwashing? Why were they making this claim? So now people are starting to realize and see, and it's entering the conversation of, oh, companies are lying about this stuff, and we need to hold them more accountable. The government's starting to do it. The courts are doing it. So as consumers, we need to be doing it too. So those are the two big things. But there are other markets doing it. The United States is starting to do it, obviously not nationally because their regulations are a bit different and the administration's different. But there have been, over the past recent months, a group of attorneys general from, I think it's 13 or 14 states, who've gotten together to look at greenwashing in the oil and gas industry and the energy sector. So it is happening, and we want to see more of that happening. But it's great to see that all of that momentum, essentially, with greenwashing fines and regulations, all of that's happened over the last year. That's a lot of momentum in a very short period of time, and I think it's only going to ramp up.
It's great. Thank you for sharing that information. But we have an issue
We have
with
lots of issues.
we have a lot of that's right. What I want to raise a hot topic here, which is AI. That this technology has enormous potential, but it's also accelerating climate misinformation and protecting entrenched interests. The last time I went to Amazon bookstore online, and I was searching for climate books, and suddenly I saw a lot of climate denial books, and I was so surprised about that. I said, "Oh my God, how many?" I don't know. I think I saw, I don't know, 3, 4.
Wow.
Where is this heading, and what guardrails do we need to prevent AI from becoming a greenwashing amplifier?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And AI is sort of it's the Wild West, right? Like nobody is
Yes.
watching this stuff. And you
Yeah,
sort of look at it objectively and you go, why isn't anybody stopping this? It's this
yeah.
train that is just it's just running down the track, running over everybody in its path. And when it comes to sustainability in AI, there's so many different layers. You have the environmental side of AI and how it just zaps resources, especially water, in the use of, anytime I do a chat, not me, but people do a chat GPT search, or they make one of those, it's fun to watch videos, but that takes a lot of resources to create, and people don't realize that. So there's the environmental aspect, there's the education component as well, because again, I don't think most people realize that there is a negative impact with their searches. They're just looking at it as a fun toy to use right now, but not thinking, oh, every time I do a search for something that I could have done a Google search for, it has a much bigger impact. But to your questions a second ago, the ethical and societal implications of AI, I find much more interesting, the things that really nobody at all is talking about. At least they're talking about the environmental side. So, how do we prevent falsification of information? I saw a post on LinkedIn today. There was I think it was an MP in the UK had made a falsified AI generated image to show crime in their district, which didn't exist. You have people like you mentioned with the books. There are companies now that are just using AI to create books, and a lot of that then becomes tools for misinformation because AI only spits out what you ask it to. So if you ask it to make a book on climate misinformation, that's what it's going to give you, and it's going to be pretty easy to do. You have online too, people, if again, going to LinkedIn, it's essentially just AI created posts now, and you can see it really easily, but a lot of that is, again, people just typing something in, spitting something out, and posting it without reviewing, not realizing that, what AI creates isn't always the truth. It loves to hallucinate. And so, again, people need to be educated on how to use AI appropriately. You look at the ethical standpoint, how do we use this in an ethical way, whether that is from a climate perspective or in human resources or hiring or whatever it might be. So there's not just one issue. There are many, many issues when it comes to AI. And the unfortunate reality, to use an overused AI term, because AI loves that phrase, and overused, or the unfortunate reality is that nobody's watching this. Like in all honesty, the internet itself is hardly governed, and we've had the internet for decades. So to try to get a handle on AI, which essentially is being pushed and managed by 4 or 5 people in Silicon Valley, we have a long way to go before anybody's really paying attention to that and doing anything meaningful around it. I mean, you think of sort of a lot of MPs and politicians that are sitting in parliaments today, they're 70, 80, 90 years old. They don't know if they hardly know anything about technology, let alone the power of AI and why it should be reined in. So that's, to me, probably the scariest thing that we're facing now. And I'm not a doomist in the sense that nobody should be using AI. I think AI is an amazing tool that can absolutely help us if it's used the right way.
Yes, that's so true. And we have started this podcast to educate or try to help educate people on the sustainability topics because it's really complex. And even with AI, it is really difficult for people to decide or to understand what is true and what is not true. Because this is really complex, sustainability, and it's confusing, and there is a lot of concepts and ideas. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I want to continue to develop more because this is a really fascinating topic, at least for me, and I think it's very interesting also for companies out there and for individuals that want to make better
Thank you, Lena.
decisions. And I would like to ask you, what can organizations do to communicate transparently and avoid greenwashing while still engaging audiences effectively and helping consumers make better decisions? Because I also think that companies should be doing that, educating consumers on making better decisions.
Absolutely. When it comes to communications, and this is sort of my part of the sustainability universe, is within the communications of sustainability. I think it's really important for organizations, companies of all sizes, the blue chip companies that are really established all the way to a startup. They need to understand a few key things and to really not just understand it, but internalize it within their business. The one thing we've already talked about is that no consumer expects a company to be perfect. They just don't want to be lied to. I think that's element number one, right? Just don't lie to people. It is really as simple as that. So with that out of the way, companies need to understand that first, they don't need to be perfect and they don't need to do everything. A lot of times companies assume that if they're going to go down the route of sustainability, they have to do everything in sustainability, and that's impossible. And it's exhausting, and there's no money to be able to do all these things, or time or resources. So really pick what it is you're trying to do in the world of sustainability. Really focus on that, and that's going to be enough. That's okay. You don't need to do it all unless you're maybe, a Fortune 100 company, then you should probably do more than most. So that's really important, first off. Second, I think it's really important that companies, particularly communications teams, understand that they should be taking their stakeholders, their audiences on a journey with them. It's not just presenting the good stuff. That's when you get yourself in trouble. That's when people start to pick things apart and go, well, why did you only give me the good stuff when you're doing all of these bad things too? Take them on the journey. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, nobody thinks you have to be perfect. So if you are struggling with something, if maybe you did something good, but you're experiencing a barrier, a struggle on another part of your sustainability journey, tell me about it. Let me know. Let me know what's going on. I just, take me on that journey with you so that I know that, you're at least trying and you're not trying to deceive me. I think it's really important as well. And that comes down to authenticity, which is a really groan worthy sort of marketing phrase. But in sustainability, it's super important that you're authentic, because if you're going to try to lie to people, you'll get found out. You're going to get in a lot more trouble than if you just kept quiet. And finally, we're also seeing sort of the backlash from greenwashing, which has been called green hushing, which is essentially companies now, they're just not talking about sustainability at all. And that's not what we want. That was never the intention. The intention was always to get companies being honest and open about things, not to scare them. So I don't want any organizational leader listening or watching this thinking, okay, well, now I just can't talk about it because my legal team says I'm not supposed to because we'll get in trouble. Well, it's only greenwashing when you lie. So then it comes back to this idea of just not this idea, this truism of just don't lie. You can't get caught out for greenwashing if you're telling the truth. So just be open, honest, authentic, and take consumers on a journey. And at the end of the day, if you know nothing else, all of that boiled down is just marketing comms 101. Just be a good storyteller and be true, honest, and authentic. It's really as simple as that. I think we've overcomplicated this. And to your point earlier, sustainability is quite complex, but the communications of sustainability should not be. It should be fairly simple to do. And one final point, sorry, that I did miss is I think a lot of times we don't really know our audiences the right way. And that's really marketing 101. Know your audience, right? So figure out who in your massive universe of stakeholders that you have, who you're communicating to, and how you're supposed to communicate best to them. Put all that stuff together, and you'll have a strong comms plan, sustainability or otherwise.
Thank you so much. And as you said, sustainability is complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated, especially in communication, because we complicate a lot.
Yes.
And this has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you for your time. Do you have any final note you would like to drop to our listeners?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think certainly we talked about organizations, right? But
Uh-huh.
certainly as individuals as well, I want everybody to remember that you don't have to be a perfect environmentalist. You don't have to do
Mhm.
everything that is there. The same, like I said, with a company, individuals too. You don't need to do everything. You can't do everything, right? Like your time, your resources, your sanity. These are all limited things. So you need to really pick what it is you're going to do to build a better future and be stuck sort of doing that. Like really enjoy and love what you're doing. Find your passion point, find what you have a special skill in, what you can contribute to, and know that there is an army of billions of people around the world doing their parts as well. And when we all come together, we will build something amazing. Don't have to do it all.
That's so true. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.